And welcome once again to this lecture series thing that I'm doing. My name is LC Lupus, and today we will be looking at what is called Roman Jakobson's communication model. Now, this is quite an important model for understanding communication, as you might see. Now, this is quite an important idea in general to understand when it comes to literary theory in general. And also it is a linguistic model. However, when it comes to literary theory, it is quite important because it puts poetics, which is basically literature, front and center in this sort of idea. Now, the basic communication model is something that is taught very, very early on in pretty much like any kind of linguistics or literary theory, whatever. So we're going to go more in depth into Roman Jakobson's version, which is sort of an elaborated version from what the basic version, which I will go into the basic version. But let's first just say here that a communication model is a way of understanding how people communicate. How do we communicate with each other? Now, in the most basicest terms, you get the idea of the sender, the message, and the receiver. You'll see them here, there, and there. Ignore these ones on top and bottom for now. In extremely basic terms, right, the sender is the person who speaks, the message is what is said, and the receiver is whoever is listening to it. And you might have heard that thing of, if there's no one to hear, or if a tree falls in a forest and there's no one to hear it, did it make a sound? That's kind of that idea where sound it depends on how people want to talk about it, but the idea that sound has to have a receiver or else it isn't actually a sound, which in terms of a more academic perspective, a more scientific perspective, not really true because it's about sound waves, but that's what this basic idea is, right? So there has to be someone who says the thing, there has to be the thing that is said, and then there has to be the person who receives it, who listens it, who hears it, interprets it, etc. But now, when it comes to Roman Jakobson, Jakobson was a major figure in early structuralism. He also came from the more Russian formalist tradition, which I have made a video about Russian formalism, if you want to know more about that. Now, the Russian formalists were basically the people who wanted to try to interpret literature, mostly poetry, through a purely formal lens. So they didn't care what it was about. What mattered was basically how it was written. That was the thing that they found to be the important part. Now, Jakobson would then move on to structuralism, which is based on semiotics. Now, we've already done some semiotic videos on this channel, and we're going to be doing more. But semiotics is, in very, very brief, the idea that basically language is representative. So it is something that represents something else in a very basic sense. If you're looking at Saussurean semiotics, which I've done a video about, it is the idea that sounds and images that make up words are actually completely arbitrary. Like the fact that one language says one word and another language says another word to mean the same word means that the sounds don't really mean anything. It's determined entirely by people, basically. And the structuralists would roll with that and then apply it to literary theory, because Saussurean semiotics it's a form of linguistics. He wasn't thinking about literature, he was thinking about ordinary language. And now the thing about Jakobson was that he wanted to combine poetics and linguistics very, very specifically together. That is what he wanted to do. Now, poetics is a term that, it doesn't mean poetry. It also means poetry, but it doesn't just mean poetry. Poetics is a broad, overarching term that basically refers to literature, really. The oldest, basically, text in literary theory is called Poetics, and it's by Aristotle. And that was actually about drama, but poetry is also mentioned. And so basically the idea that poetics, right, so poetry, novels, whatever, is combined with linguistics, which is the more Saussurean semiotic thing. It's actually looking at language itself. And that's what he wanted to do. So he wanted to extend semiotics to literature, which would be what structuralism in literary theory basically is. And there are many, many different structuralists, and I'm probably going to cover quite a lot of structuralists on this channel over the coming months. But yeah, so that's what he wanted to do. And that's why he came up with this semiotic model, this communication model, right? Now, as I said, the very basic terms are sender, message, receiver, right? So I am the sender, in this case, I am saying things. The things I am saying is the message, and it's being sent to you, the receiver. But you can do this with anything. There is the poet, the sender. There is the poem, the message. And there is the reader of the poem, which will be the receiver. Or, of course, the novelist, the novel, the person who reads it. It can be used in ordinary language. It can be used in poetic language. He wanted to extend it, and he also kind of claimed that there is a poetic angle to kind of all language, really. One of the central problems of Russian formalism was that there was sort of the claim that there was something special about literature. It had what's called literariness, which means that it made use of certain techniques and what have you that were unique to literature, that were unique to poetry, except that they're not unique to poetry. In ordinary communication, just talking, we make use of things like metaphors and similes and, sure, things like maybe alliteration, assonance, whatever. Maybe they're not as common, but that doesn't mean they're unused. They're just more used in poetic circumstances, in poetry and novels and whatever. So we do still use these things, and that's what he kind of was saying here. So, right, that's the basic part. But now you need to understand these ones that are on top and below. Now, you could put any of them on top, below, it doesn't really matter. They're just not part of the central chain, right? They exist outside of it. So sender, message, receiver, that's the main thing. But that doesn't actually explain all of communication. You also need to know the context. Now, context is a very, very broad term, but very, very basically, context refers to whatever is around a text or around a message. In this case, I'm going to use the term message because it could be, right, it could be what I'm saying, it could be a poem, it could be a novel. All the same, it doesn't matter. The context is what's around that, right? So let's look at the context of this particular video, right? You will only truly understand this video if you understand the context. Now, if you're just going into this video, you clicked on this video, and you've never heard of literature, you've never heard of linguistics, you've never heard of lectures, you've never heard of any of these things, you're going to be at a bit of a loss. We expect you to know what literature is. For instance, I say poem, expecting you to know what a poem is. If you didn't know what a poem was or what a novel was, you'd be confused because that is contextual information, right? So if I don't know what a book is, then I can't talk to you about books. Now you might think, well, everyone knows about books, everyone knows about movies, everyone knows about speaking, but that's what context is. You've learnt it somewhere else. So imagine if I had to explain everything I was saying. If I had to be like, okay, so a sender, which could be a person. Now, a person is like a human who is capable of language. Language is a thing, a complex means of communication based on, usually specific types of syntax and what have you. Now, communication is the ability for us to be able to understand one another. Understanding is the idea that, you see, if you had to explain what all these things mean, we would be here forever. I would never get to the point. Because I expect you to understand that contextual information. I expect you to understand what's around it. Now, when it comes to, say, a book, if a book is set in World War II, if you have no idea what World War II is, or if you have no idea what war is, you won't know what is going on. You'll be like, what is this whole, fighting thing? If you don't know what war is, you're not going to understand what's going on. So that is what context is, right? It's understanding what is around a thing that is being said. Now, in ordinary communication, this exists too. When I'm just talking to you, I don't expect you to stop me every 5 seconds to ask me what a word means, because I expect you to have learnt those words. If I was to say, I'm going to the shops, if I had to explain what the words I'm, meaning the self, going, meaning proceeding to a place, and shops, meaning a place at which I can purchase goods. If you didn't know what those terms were, communication would take forever. I expect you to know what a shop is. I expect you to know what I'm means. I expect you to know these things because that's the context, right? So it's everything that is around it. Now, a really great way I've seen it explained as well is if you take a word, right, a word on its own, let's say a word like, let's say shop. Shop on its own means a place at which I can purchase goods. However, the word shop only makes sense within the context of a sentence it's in. So, I'm going to the shops. All of a sudden, there's more context. Now, it's not just a shop, it's specifically about me going to the place. So, it's not actually about the shops, it's about me. See, the context has changed. If I put that in a paragraph about how I don't have money, and then I was to say, talking about how I don't have money, and then at the end I say, I'm going to the shops. It now has a completely new context, because now the context is he's going to the shops even though he doesn't have money. It now becomes something maybe darker, right? So the context changes based on the more you add. And if that was inside a book, the context is different, because who wrote that book? Where did it come from? When was it written? All of these things are the context. So the context is very important. So that's context, right? So I need to be able to understand the context to be able to understand the message. However, I also need to know about what the channel is. Now, channel is the medium through which it is told. So if I'm just speaking to you, the medium is the vocalized expression, right? I'm talking words and you are hearing words. That's the channel. But if I write it down and then you read it, that's a different channel. Right now it's written. Now, as a matter of fact, what we're actually doing now, this actually isn't me just talking to you. You're watching a video, which means you are actually looking through a recording of the past, which recorded what I had said, which is different to if I was just talking to you, right? So the channel can change. That's very simple, right? The channel is just the medium through which it is told. However, it changes what I'm expected, what's expected of me in a different channel, right? So if I'm just having a friendly conversation with you, that's one thing. If I'm doing a lecture, so I'm a teacher explaining a concept to you in a classroom, that's different. That changes the channel, because now you can't just talk to me. I'm explaining things to you. If I'm a person in a video, which is what this thing is, you definitely can't talk. I can't answer you. You could make comments, and then I could respond to you in the comments, but that is a different communication, right? Now I'm speaking to you beyond the video. So the channel changes, and the channel can change the way in which I am able to talk to you, to others, whatever. Lastly, the code. The code is basically a term meaning, like language, you need to understand the conventions of a language. You need to know English, right? And you also need to know the specifics of the type of English I'm speaking. There's many, many different types of English. If, say, I was speaking now I have quite, I believe, a more neutral accent, so I can be quite understandable to most people. If you know English, you can probably understand me. However, if someone has a very, very thick accent, right, it can be much harder to understand them. But that goes more into that kind of aspect, right? Whereas somebody who has that accent can understand perfectly, right? If I don't know your accent, you don't know my accent, we might struggle with each other. We can both speak English, but the accent can be quite difficult. Like, for instance, there's a movie that some people might know. It's called Trainspotting. And that movie has Scottish characters, and some of them have extremely thick Scottish accents. And my fiancée, who is first language Afrikaans, but she can speak fluent English, she struggles because it is so thick that she can't understand it properly. Now she's having a bit of an issue there, where she can't, they're speaking English, it is English, but she can't understand it because it's a different form of English. That is an important thing to keep in mind. So now that is the communication model, right? There's the sender, there's the message, there's the receiver, there's the context to help you understand it, there's the channel through which it is told, and there's the code, which is sort of our language and our traditions, which we, the conventions rather. It decided to run out of space on the video card, so I don't remember exactly what I was saying last, but I'm pretty sure I was pretty much wrapping up this the main idea. I have very little left to talk about, so it's very irritating that the card couldn't wait a few minutes. But anyway, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Let's move on. So anyway, you might be wondering why I'm only using certain terms here. Why am I using message and context, but not referential and poetic? That's because those aren't really the terms that Jakobson used. Now, those terms are much easier to understand, but the actual terms are more emotive, referential, poetic, connotative, metalingual, and emphatic. Those are the actual terms, because why not make it more complicated? Now, these are actually also called codes. So it's the referential code, the emotive code, and these are all what are called functions, right? So as a final thing here, these are what he called the functions of language, which make up the communication model. Now, if you know these terms, cool. If you don't know them, the terms as well, it's okay. It can be useful to know them. If you're writing, say, an assignment, use them both, right? Because then you can look. Now, if you can't remember, say, for an exam, that is okay. Just use context, message, whatever. You don't need to say poetic, because these can be confusing. You know, poetic makes sense, right? He was saying that sort of all communication in some sense is poetic, so it makes sense that the message would be that. Emotive and sender, you know, to most people that's a bit of a strange one. Connotative, most people don't know what that even means. Referential makes some sense, right? Referential instead of context, because it's referential, so it's referring to other things. Emphatic, also most people don't really know what that term means. And metalingual also is a bit of a harder term, but metalingual pretty much means, meta means beyond something, and lingual means language. So it's basically the language aspects and what is beyond that. So it's a little bit annoying, but it's fine, you know. So if you can understand those concepts, it really makes it's easy. So just remember, there's a sender, there's a message, there is a receiver, and you require a context to make sense, or a referential code, and you require a channel, the means through which we are communicating, which is the emphatic code, and of course there's the code, or metalingual code, which is the language and the conventions of the language through which we are communicating. So quite simple idea in general. So, right, you need a person who's speaking, you need a message that is being told or written or whatever, you need a person who is receiving it, you need a context around which it is based, you need a channel through which it is being told, and you need the language through which it is being told. It requires a language. You can't communicate something telepathically. Even say a picture is a message, because we can understand visual information, right? Music without lyrics is also a message, because we can understand notes. So these are all, the different functions. And as I just put you at the very end here, these are in every utterance. So it's not just in poetry, it's also in books, it's also in speaking to each other, it's also in film, whatever. It is kind of in everything, or at least it can be applied to every form of communication. If we're communicating, you can apply this model to it. And that's pretty much it. That is Roman Jakobson's communication model. Hopefully this has explained it well enough. If I sound slightly off, I'm also still a little bit sick. I've been sick for like 2 weeks, so I sound a little bit gross. So I got to wrap this up. So that is the model. Now, if you enjoyed this, cool, do the usual things, the like, comment, subscribe, whatever. If there's any other concepts or whatever you want explored, you can pop them down below, and I'll see if I know it. More literary concepts, literary and philosophical. You know, I can't do maths at all. I was very, very excited once when a student asked me to help her with an equation, and I managed to figure out how the equation worked. And I was so happy with myself, because I hadn't done any maths in 10 years. And but otherwise, no. It's not for me. It's not for me. This, cool. That, no. So, now that's all over. Cool. All done. If you like this, do those usual things. And also, if you want to support the channel, whatever way, you can also check out my books. They'll all be linked down below. The latest one, which I'm going to put the picture here, is called Parked In. Parked In is about it asks the question, basically, what if a parking space, as in the thing you park your car on, like in a mall or something, what if it could think? What if it could have feelings and thoughts about things? What if it had opinions? And that is what Parked In is about. The main character is literally that parking space that is pictured on the cover. It's an actual parking space as well from near where I used to live. And that parking space has some thoughts about humanity. So, if you're interested, go have a look. All things are in the description. And otherwise, I hope you have a great day, week, and month ahead, and enjoy yourself.